My department owns and operates under statute 6 Fishery Harbour Centres at Killybegs, Rossaveel, Dingle, Castletownbere, Dunmore East and Howth. Properties located in the Fishery Harbour Centres are, when appropriate, offered for tenancy under lease or licence agreements. An individual agreement, which is a formal, legally binding document on both parties, is voluntarily signed at the outset by the tenant. My department currently has in the region of 140 property agreements in place in the 6 fisheries harbours. Property agreements are complex instruments, and the specific terms of those agreements held with my department vary. Of the total in place, approximately 80 property agreements do not contain rent review clauses, which require rent to be static or increased in the subsequent period. These include short-term licence agreements and pending lease agreements. Any property agreements entered into subsequent to the application of Section 132 of the Land and Conveyancing Law Reform Act 2009 contain rent review clauses in which the rent payable following the review may be fixed at an amount which is less than, greater than, or the same as the amount of rent payable immediately prior to the date on which the rent falls to be reviewed. In the region of 60 lease agreements contain rent review clauses which require static or increased rent to be applied for the subsequent period. All 60 of the property agreements that contain such rent review clauses were signed prior to the application of Section 132 of the Land and Conveyancing Law Reform Act 2009. These agreements generally require rent reviews to be conducted every 5 years. The most recent round of rent reviews on these agreements related to the period up to mid-2008. A number of the rental valuations determined by the qualified valuer appointed by the department following a tender competition were disputed by the tenants. The rent review dispute procedures set out in the tenants' leases were followed, and in some cases the independent experts recommended a decrease in the revised valuation determined by the valuer acting on behalf of the department. And just final paragraph. I am acutely aware of the economic situation facing businesses and small enterprises, and following the completion of rent reviews due for the period up to mid-2008, I decided in 2011 that no rent reviews would be carried out for years subsequent to 2008, and that zero rent increases would apply across the board. I have recently decided to continue this approach in relation to rent reviews due in 2013, and a zero rent increase will apply in all such cases. In other words, what we're doing is we have a practical response here, Deputy, whereby in law we are entitled to look at either an increase or a stagnant rent on the basis of a rent review, and we've decided that the easiest way to deal with this is to simply not review those rents so that they don't go up for the tenants, for the tenants in question.
Just to Deputy Pringle.
Thank you, Laskin. Yeah, Minister, while that may be a practical response, I think it's a response that maybe just doesn't go far enough. I mean, we all know, and none more so than yourself, how circumstances have changed since 2008 in the last reviews. And in very many cases, those rents were set at the peak market values. And many businesses are struggling now to meet those rents. And I think it would be an extension of that process if the department took a proactive view and looked at the possibility of reducing those rents where it would be justified, because I think that would go a long way to enabling people to preserve their businesses and keep their businesses going, and allow for businesses to have that room to maybe expand and create jobs as well. And I think that would be in line with the Fine Gael proposals in advance of the election and that as well, to implement a process like that, and it would be the fairest way of going forward with it.
Thank you, Deputy. Minister.
We've looked at that, Deputy, but it's not that easy to do it. When a lease is signed, and there is no mechanism in that lease to reduce rent, i.e. it stays as it is or increases, well then reducing rent isn't straightforward from a legal point of view. And so what I have decided to do is that instead of going through this process and the cost of it and the hassle of it for both sides, because there needs to be, arbitration in terms of agreeing valuations and rents and so on, that the easiest way for the moment is to simply not have that review, which then gives tenants some certainty that actually their rent isn't going to increase, which I think is a reasonable response in the circumstances. If there is a case to be made that we are overcharging for rent, well, then we need to look at that. But actually, when any rent reviews have been done, there has been a recommendation actually for an increase, and I don't think that's appropriate given the kind of pressures that a lot of businesses are under at the moment.
Minister. Deputy Pringle, briefly.
Surely, Minister, I mean, if there was movement on both sides, where the tenant and the landlord were in agreement to look at the process, it would be possible to arrive at a situation whereby agreement from both sides that a rent could be reduced in the interests of keeping a business going and keeping it in place and giving it the opportunity to maybe create extra jobs and be more sustainable. And I think that would be vitally important, and I think there needs to be a will within the department and I'm sure if there was a will, there definitely would be a way where both sides could agree to alter the terms of the lease and arrive at a rent that would be agreeable to both.
Thank you. Final reply from the Minister.
I mean, we need to balance two things here. One, we need to ensure that we're not charging rents that are over the top for businesses. But secondly, we need to run 6 fisheries harbours in a business-like manner so that they can pay for themselves, if possible, and pay for the investment that's needed in a lot of those harbours that has been happening over many years. So we're trying to balance our obligations as a landlord to be fair to the tenants, to keep them in business as best we can by not applying rents that are over the top, but at the same time we actually get an acceptable commercial income from all of the tenancies that we have within our harbours, and we're trying to balance the two, which is why I've tried to give certainty to businesses by saying, look, we're not going to go through the rent review process. Some of the rent reviews that we did go ahead with actually recommended an increase in rent. That's the point I'm making. So just because you review this and ask an independent assessor to review it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get a recommendation to reduce rent. Of course, tenants will want lower rent all the time, but I have to balance running harbours in a business-like commercial manner so that I can invest in those harbours and at the same time not treat tenants unfairly. And that's why I think putting off any rent reviews, so we essentially freeze rent for the foreseeable future, I think that's a reasonable way to proceed.
We now go on to